I has to. Uh, so yeah, we're gonna start it off with land acknowledgement, and the land that we are currently on is currently known as Windsor and Essex County, is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, and also the Wendat. Before that, it was uh, it was the homeland of their ancestors. And I think it's important to recognize not just that it's ancestral land, but that currently it is treaty territory and we have obligations that we have to uphold that we agreed upon. We agreed to share this land. And as archaeologists, we have to remember, or we do remember as archaeologists, that history is more than just something in the pages of a textbook. We hold it in our hands every day. The past is a part of us, and this is something that we need to remember. We are not removed from the past. The past essentially determines who we are today. And if we think this way, then we can act today in ways that we are conscious will affect the future, because the time we are living in today will one day be the history that creates the future. And so, with this in mind, I would like to begin. And I would like to thank Amanda and Barb. They've been listening to me talk about my dissertation all summer. And they invited me to speak here today. I'd like to thank you all for coming out. It's quite cold. I would like to thank Kyle for tuning in the comfort of his home. I know we're all envious. Um, my name is, as Amanda said, my name is Miroslav Tomoski, and I've worked with most of you in this room here. So you know me, so I don't necessarily need to give you an introduction, but I will. I am a CRM archaeologist. I work for TMHC and CRM Group. I recently finished my master's at the University of Leicester in Western Basin pottery. And that's what you've been told that I'm here to talk to you about today, pots. But we're not, like, we will talk about pots, but mostly we'll be talking about two things: symbols and identity, and how we can draw identity, how and if we can draw identity out of the material culture that we pull out of the ground. And with this in mind, I'm going to be expecting a little bit of class participation today. I know those are probably dreaded words, but I'm going to start with a little bit of a experiment, and I'm going to show you an image. I'm going to ask you to tell me what you see. So do I have any volunteers to tell me what you see?
Green stop sign.
Green stop sign. Interesting. Okay, I was expecting green octagon or any other thing like that, but actually, that was great. That was great, because I was hoping someone would say stop sign. If I show you this, now what do you all see? You see a stop sign, of course. A proper stop sign.
Go sign?
What's that? The other one would technically be a go sign, yes. But it's interesting. I'm glad you said green stop sign, because it proved the point even more, because it was supposed to be that you guys would say this would be a stop sign even without the words. We intuitively recognize this because it's been drilled into our heads. Anywhere in the world, you can go anywhere in the world, it doesn't even have to say stop in English. You know what this symbol represents, you know what it's asking you to do. And if I change the color of the symbol, your brain still goes stop sign because it's an octagon. So I want you to keep this in mind. And keep in mind the symbols that we sort of all agree upon when we see them. There's nothing intrinsically halting about an octagon. There is something about the color red that sort of makes you think stop, but there's nothing about this shape that should mean stop, but it does mean that to all of us. We all agree that that's what it means. And so that is an example of a symbol, and we will be talking about symbols. We will also be talking about identity. And I'm going to ask for class participation again, and I'm going to add, if I asked you how you would identify yourself, how you would describe your identity, what would you say? Anybody?
What, how are you defining identity?
It's an open question. It's
Personality? Are you talking about occupation? Are you talking geographically?
It's a personal question, however you would personally.
Or I would say that my identity exists entirely in relation to other people, in that it's modified in how I describe it, given who I'm identifying myself to.
Okay.
Because we all wear many hats. So
Yes.
I could define myself by function. I define myself by my gender, how I look, my age, the nationality, the language I speak, the generation I was born into.
Very much what Maria was saying.
Right.
Well, like there are many ways.
But the context is
Yes.
well said. Thank you.
Would anyone like to give it a shot for themselves?
Well, I'm saying it's like I was trying to be very fast and very
Yeah.
joking, but I'm not like a polyglot. Many things.
Right. Right.
I guess in the primary sense, your name is the core of identity. Most people very strongly identify with that first. Hello, I am.
Of course. Now, interestingly, what I did not hear with the exception of the mentioned hats is identifying yourself with the use of an object. Would anyone here identify themselves with an object?
It's called yellow people.
Hey, yellow people. We were field walking and we were wearing high vis. Jamie?
I would say we're defined as like what we're looking for. Like we do identify.
Right.
Like we'll say, oh, he's an archaeologist, but he's also funny, good
Yes.
personality. So I think it's for other people to find as well as what we distinguish ourselves as.
Oh, a trial. Almost all of us will identify with a similar trial. It is
Similar
kind of
trial.
universally accepted as an archaeological.
Yes.
My tattoo kind of proves that.
Kara, for example, might identify with her shovel.
And my wood hat.
Kara has a shovel. She likes to use that shovel. She only likes to use that shovel. She is angry when she cannot use that shovel.
Have you ever been? Yeah.
I've been threatened. That's absent. But the interesting thing is that the shovel itself doesn't really tell us about Kara. I mean, it could tell us a couple of things about Kara. We could identify where she got it, depot. We can identify that she likes to dig with light shovels, really light shovel. But it doesn't tell us that she's a mother or a friend or a grandmother. It doesn't tell us all of these things that she might use to identify herself. And yet, as archaeologists, we use objects all the time to say things about the identity of the people behind it. And so today we are going to look at what can pots tell us about people, and we're going to be exploring links between material and identity And not just what can pots tell us about people, but can pots even tell us anything about people? And in particular, we're going to be talking about Western Basin pottery. This is a Western Basin pot from right here in Leamington, Cherry Lane. And I'm sure you've all heard the term, I mean, this is a room full of archaeologists or otherwise interested people, so I'm sure you've all heard the term Western Basin. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to sort of explore what Western Basin means. And we're going to do what archaeologists love to do, which is we're going to have a look at the context. So why do we call it the Western Basin tradition? In southwestern Ontario, we have two major traditions. Down here where we are and up into like Walpole and up this way and sort of towards the Thames and towards Rondo is the Western Basin tradition. And then once you get up into this area, it's the Ontario Iroquoian tradition. So what the Western Basin tradition is it's an archaeological term. It's not the way that the people behind the material recognize themselves as, but because we don't have access to that, we call it the Western Basin culture. In 1965, James Fitting, essentially we were pulling a bunch of stuff out of the ground and we hadn't organized it yet into a chronology. James Fitting organized it into a chronology and he gave each phase of that chronology a name. Riviera Vaz, Young, Springwells, Wolf phases were established. And Springwells is highlighted in red there because it's the period that we are going to be focusing on. It's the pots that we are going to be looking at. And that's around 1100 to 1350. Even those dates are debated from time to time, but that's what we're going to go with. And if you notice, that's about 300 years before Europeans even arrive in this region. So what that means is that we have very little in the way of written records to go off of. So we can only derive what we know from the material that we find. In 1972, David Stothers from the University of Toledo and his colleagues define it as the Western Basin tradition. And that's because this material is found in southeastern Michigan, Essex County, and the regions I mentioned above, as well as northern Ohio. And this is the Western Basin of Lake Erie. Now, because Stothers and all of the other archaeologists studying this didn't have access to any written records of the identity of the people who left behind all of this stuff, a debate emerged in the 1980s and then the 1990s about the ethno-linguistic origin of the people who left behind these plots. And David Stothers, using patterns that he observed in burial, in subsistence, in dwellings, he assumed that they were Iroquoian speaking and of Iroquoian origin. They were related in some way to the Ontario Iroquoian tradition. Yet Ferris at the University of Western inferred an Algonquin origin using the same information. He saw patterns in the dwellings, patterns of burial, patterns of subsistence that suggested Algonquin origin. He later shifted away from this debate, and we'll see why a little bit later. David Stothers unfortunately passed away before the debate began to shift. And when we think about this, so we look at this, we can see some similarities. This is an Iroquoian, a typical Iroquoian pot, and this is a typical Western Basin pot. They have similar shapes. They have similar castellations. They have a similar general shape. But once we start to look at this area and the way that it's decorated, it begins to show up a little different. Now, it might seem a little silly to determine an entire culture based off of a pot or based off of the things that they left behind, but this is something that is actually rather common in archaeology. Pots often are used as analogs for cultures in the way that they spread. And even ChatGPT, when you ask ChatGPT anything, it pulls information off of the internet and it gives you an amalgamation of what is out there. And what is out there is that pots are related to social identity and they are culturally specific. So this is a common understanding of pottery around the world. One really big example, really popular example is bell beaker pots, which are these that you see in front of you. These are found in Europe and North Africa, and they're about 5,000 years old. And initially, when archaeology was a little bit more of a ethnocentric sort of iffy discipline, we thought that this was proof that the appearance of bell beaker pots was proof of conquest. These people who use these pots moved to another region, they brought the pots with them, they forced the people who lived there to also assimilate into their culture. More recent looks at this indicate that it's proof of trade. The proof that these bell beaker pots were traded around a wide area over a long period of time. The same goes for Mission Era pottery in Florida. There are, in this part of Florida, it's sort of like the northern Atlantic coast of Florida. There were 4 distinct types of pottery. And as the Spanish came in, one type of pottery began to be most prominent. And archaeologists have tried to answer this. And some of the answers have been, well, the indigenous population got together and formed a new identity, and they formed a new identity, and that's what's coming through in this pot choice. But when we look a little closer, we see that certain features of certain like spiritual symbols, certain features of that pottery were still retained in the new type that had been taking over. So it's a little more complicated than just the movement of people, and it's a little more complicated than identity. So where are we today? Pots are not just people. Pots are not people. Pots do not translate neatly into a specific identity. Some features are tied to identity, others are tied to trade, to utility, and others we've sort of lost the meaning of altogether. And this category, for which we've lost the meaning of, is sort of where we are with spring wells, because we can identify the shapes, we can identify patterns in the shapes, but we don't know what those shapes meant to the people who created them. And so what we get from this is that broad regional taxonomies are not necessarily useful when you're asking questions of identity, because we don't know for sure if people here identified themselves by the pots, or if they identified themselves regionally, or if they identified linguistically even, they might have spoken both languages, both Iroquoian and Algonquin. They might have spoken a variety of languages. It's kind of like saying, if we were to make an analogy to European cultures, it's kind of like saying French people, Italians, Spaniards, and Romanians are all Latins. Technically, that's true. That would be a valid category because they're linguistically, they are all related. But if you told a French person they are the same as an Italian, I bet you would get I bet you would get some kickback.
Or Greek with lots of it.
Or a Greek and a Macedonian. So applying these taxonomies on a regional scale doesn't really make sense when we're talking about cultures that we don't actually know how to define yet, and we don't know how they define themselves. Now, if we're talking about post-contact cultures, we can make some assumptions, we can make some inferences because we have a better idea of how they identified and of where the groups sort of like who they were allied with. We have more of this information. But to apply Iroquoian or Ojibwe or the things that we are familiar with today retroactively is not really effective in getting at the true identity of the people who inhabited this area. And that's where that's towards the end of the 90s, that's where Ontario archaeologists moved towards. In 1997, there was a symposium between the joint symposium between the OAA and the Midwestern Archaeological Conference. And they were told to submit, the attendees of this symposium were told to submit papers that did not include the traditional taxonomies. Now, as you can imagine, that's got to be a very difficult thing to do, but it forced them to sort of challenge the way that we think and the categories that we have been sort of pigeonholed into, or at least the categories that we've accepted. And it actually produced a book at the end of all of their papers, and it's called Taming the Taxonomies. And I would really recommend it. But this was a notion that was already known for quite a while. Early in the mid 80s, Lennox and Kenyon published a paper about how what we read into pots largely comes from the standards that we set, what we're focusing on. And so depending on our methods, depending on what we want to focus on, it can affect the results of the analysis. And we can almost get what we want to see out of the pot rather than what's actually there. And in more recent times, papers have been published that revise the typologies that we have. This one in particular took the original 3 typologies that we used for Western Basin pots, which were linear for the patterns on the pots, linear, interrupted linear, and other. And from those 3 categories, they got 10 categories. And all of a sudden, the data looks different. So for my particular study, for my my master's thesis, I adopted a methodology that was introduced by Chris Watts in 2008. He conducted a study across 7 sites in southwestern Ontario, both of the Western Basin and the Iroquoian tradition. And he wanted to see what sort of patterns emerge. And he tested all sorts of, every aspect of the pot that you can imagine. He tested the width of the pot, the shapes of the pot, the sizes of the pots. He did the techniques, the materials, the patterns, the motifs on the outside. And what came back was he plugged all of that in using the Robinson-Brainerd coefficient, I think it's called. It's fancy math that was designed for specifically to compare ceramics. And what he got back was that across the region, the form of the pot, the general shape, was the same. At some point in pot making in southwestern Ontario, we all agreed that this is what a pot should look like. And whether they were Iroquoian or whether they were Western Basin, this was the general shape of the pots. The general shape of the pots was all the same. When you got to the details, to this part of the pot, where we claim we find the identity of the potters, things got a little bit more fuzzy. And Western Basin pots in particular showed more variation. Not only did they show more variation when compared to Iroquoian pots, but they showed more variation within Western Basin within the Western Basin group. So there were some sites, some Western Basin sites that were more similar to Iroquoian sites than they were to their own cultural tradition. And within the Iroquoian sites, there was a lot more uniformity. There was still a bit of freedom, but there was a lot more uniformity, and generally the Iroquoian pots look like this with minimal decoration up here on the top portion, and it's usually linear decoration like that. And it doesn't quite get as complicated as this. So these are just some of the criteria that Chris Watts used and that I have also used in my study. So this is the motif, this is the technique, and this is the tool used. And so you would be looking at a pot, and you would identify which one of these is present, which one of these is present, which one of these is present. And once you've done that with all the pots, you would compare them and see where they match up. And most of them did not match up, especially on the Western Basin sites. Let's take a look at what this looks like on the pot. So here we can identify the kind of tool that was used, like the motif is linear right oblique. We can identify that this was an incision. We can identify all kinds of things. And then down here, we see that like multiple tools were used. This is an individual tool, and this is a different tool here and a different type. So like this here, even with this criteria, it's not complex enough I think it's not complex enough to capture what's going on here. Because even with the criteria that we saw, this is classified as horizontal difference. So that could be split up into many more different categories if we want to get even more granular with it, and we should want to get more granular with it. And this has also been used. Chris Watts' methodology has also been used in a couple of other studies. So a pattern is beginning to emerge in southwestern Ontario with this focus on micro variations. And one of the places that a pattern is beginning to emerge is in the Arkona cluster. And the reason the Arkona cluster is chosen here for these studies is because Arkona, there are a number of sites around Arkona, Ontario, and this area is deemed a border region between these two cultural groups, Western Basin and Ontario Iroquois. And so they wanted to test what's going on here, pots. Are we seeing a clear delineation between Western Basin and Ontario Iroquois? And the results are interesting. The results show that there is no particular regional loyalty when it comes to how the pots are made and how the pots are decorated. At the Van Biesen site, there's variation even within the single site. There's varying methods to how they make the pots. We also see varying methods within certain households. We see the suggestion that if indeed this does tell us about the identity of the potter, then we see evidence of multiple cultures mixing on this border region. We even see them creating new types of pots and new designs that don't exist anywhere else and are unique to that specific site in that specific region. So all of this is to say that when we think about what we can say about identity and pottery, we should be focusing on the details, and micro variations are very important. So in my own study, I didn't study the border regions. I wanted to see if this was happening between sites that are relatively close together and sites that we all agree are Western based. And so two sites in particular, Cherry Lane and Verna, they're like within 5 kilometers of each other, I want to say. They're a few kilometers away. It's reasonable to believe that the people who occupy these sites might have interacted at some point. And what we get is the exact same thing that Chris Watts and others have observed, which is that even within the sites, this is an example of a few thoughts from these two sites. Even within the sites, I mean, you can see certain similarities. You can see like there's the use of triangles here and the use of triangles here, but it's hardly the same pot. And what we get is extreme variation within these camps, within these settlements, that suggests that now when it comes to the shape of the pot, the shape is still the same. That still holds. But when it comes to the way that in which the potter decides to decorate this, there seems to be a certain level of freedom in deciding that. And so that makes it kind of difficult to say that maybe, okay, if it has a certain pattern, maybe it's meant to hold water, or maybe it's meant to hold food, or maybe it's meant to like this or that. But it makes it kind of difficult when all of the pots are different. And this might be a sampling problem because, as you all know, there aren't very many pots coming from these sites relatively to like other places around the world where you have like hundreds of pots coming out of these sites. There's roughly like 35 pots on each site. And that's not a terribly large amount. So it could be a sampling error. Maybe there are some similar pots that are smashed and that we can't ever rebuild. But with the evidence that we have, no two pots are alike. So what can we conclude from this? The conclusions are that, and we return to the stop sign. As archaeologists, our perspective, the way that we see things, as Kenyon and Lennox pointed out, the way that we see things, the way that the things that we choose to focus on can affect the answers that we get. So if we're looking for a regional identity, we will look for things that show us a regional identity. But what we need to do a lot more of, and what this evidence is showing us that we need to do a lot more of, is that we need to think locally when we're thinking about identity, not regionally, because the evidence is showing us that if identity can be found in a pot, it is found on a micro local level. So we need to think locally. And we need to consult a little more with traditional knowledge if we want to gain access to that. I said I would return to the stop signs. The reason we all know what a stop sign is, whether it's written in Ojibwe, Arabic, or French, is we've all agreed what a stop sign means. At some point, the people who created these pots might have agreed this is the way you decorate. Or maybe they didn't. But we have no way of knowing that without in some way trying to access the cultural context. And the reason I opened today with the notion that we are our history, we are not separate from our history, is because even though it's been hundreds of years, the knowledge that is passed down today among Indigenous communities has a connection to that past. And as Augustine Fuentes, he's a professor at UCLA, as noted, without access to the context of the meaning makers, we cannot accurately know what a symbol means. And so we see this being tested today in various studies that have been employed. There are traditional stories that speak of pottery. They speak of the way that it's crafted. They speak of what we can glean from the stories that are available out there is that what we've assumed as archaeologists is that is that women are in charge of pottery making. That's the evidence that we've seen, and the stories corroborate that. They say that the grandmothers and the elders are the pot keepers, or the keepers of that knowledge, at least for the stories that are out there. Now, one thing we need to keep in mind is that these stories are usually closely guarded knowledge, and we need to be mindful about how we access that and the ethics behind that. But when it comes to understanding how the ancestors of the people that are still around today identified, we need to consult with those communities that are still around today. And modern day craftspeople can also show us a lot. That study I mentioned earlier about in Florida, they also consulted modern day potters. And from that, they gleaned that there's no way that people coming in could have learned this knowledge easily. This is a generational thing because you have to know where to find the clay. You have to know the proper mixture so the clay doesn't fall apart. There are many aspects to this that make it generational knowledge that people coming in couldn't have known. And so what they believe is that these pots were mass produced by local potters, because the people coming in, Spaniards and other tribes that were kicked out and came to Florida, were demanding these pots a lot more than the locals did. And so with that, I want to once again throw it out to you guys and ask, what questions should we be asking if we are looking for identity in material cultures?
It's all about tools. Like, because you have to figure out what they were using, and if you find out, like, let's say they're using bone tools, then you can figure out what animals they were hunting.
Right.
Like through the weirdest, like smallest, narrowest, you can learn something.
Yeah.
And I think that's the only way to do it. Styles aren't going to tell us anything if they're all different, unfortunately, except for the fact that potters probably held great pride in their difference, but unfortunately, that's a very common mistake. Like a certain style or a certain move, probably associated with yourself, a certain.
Where is they being procured from, and if there's any efforts like juvenile sites, right, you should have the cultural transformation from.
Within sites, bus and households, are there differences between families?
Mm-hmm. That's it.
Why I say that is because when we did the Karen site,
Yeah.
there were at least 3 different families.
Interesting.
And I would say from what I can remember of it, there were occasions where at least 2 of them occurred in the same pit. I'd have to.
Fabric does it.
Fabric as in like the material that the pot is made of. Yes. Okay. Not like linen. Yeah. That is interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that falls within your Western Basin category.
Not necessarily, but it's,
What's that other one?
yeah.
We've had a couple of lectures on there. It's been a long time since I've read all this stuff. The other thing is. The peoples who are in this area. To be recorded. Who are recorded at contact,
Yes,
which does not necessarily mean they were people who are here.
yes. There is that as well, yes.
And there is, I don't know how much favor there is in this these days.
Mhm.
But it used to be contended that the Erie,
Mhm.
whatever they were, in Ohio.
Yeah.
Were an Iroquoian group,
Yes,
and that down in greater southwestern Ontario, there was another group that was classified as the neutrals.
yes, yeah, yeah.
Also,
And that's all, yeah.
And so, and they were also an Iroquoian group. So discussing these Iroquois looking pots in the context of the people who were in contact.
Let's the debate that we should.
Yeah, yes, yes.
Like, I remember talking, I had the pleasure of speaking with David.
Mhm.
And Chris Watts and his overseer, David Smith.
Mhm.
And that was. David, by the end, was like, I think that actually gravitated, was like from that original
Yes,
Iroquoian
yeah.
distinction.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, as I said, it's the people that were, encountered when Europeans got here. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the people that were here before. And so applying that name to that sort of retroactively doesn't really make sense unless we have substantially good evidence to say so. Michael, did you want to say something?
I did, we have to be able to understand that our own cultural biases in our culture towards categorization, especially the refinement and constant need to subdivide things into smaller and smaller categories. Which
Yes.
seem very alien probably to a lot of these cultures that you just go, why would you divide those two things?
Yeah.
Why would that
Yes.
pattern be here instead of there?
Very modern thing, but everything into a lot.
Yeah,
But also to think that our recognition of patterns is not biased by our own culture and experiences.
Mhm.
And to go, well, these two things are similar, but the people who made them would have said, they're absolutely nothing. Why? Because there's dots. That's why. That kind of thing. But also recognize, I think, that sometimes we tend to see ceremony or patterns and things that are just solving problems, because pottery ultimately solves a problem. And so oftentimes the technology converges because it's solving the same problem. Teapots tend to look like teapots because you're trying to pour tea.
Yeah.
And there's a sort of a limited number of ways to do that. And or also it could be there's a technique that we don't know about that caused a convergence of shape. Because it turns out that's a really good way to make a pot that solves the problem you're trying to solve.
Spread.
And that idea spread because somebody's like, hey, you know what? I've got a much easier way to do that. And people are like, oh, this is great. And then we come along.
And there's no wall there that says, well, no, I'm not gonna make it that way because I'm not
No, well,
part
that's
of your group.
hey, go check this out. We're imitative monkeys.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, a lot of the sources that we have of contact, we're viewing things through an extremely culturally biased lens of very, very strict misunderstanding.
Yeah. And that comes with its own problems.
Yes,
Yes.
of taxonomy and
Yeah.
So it's being able to turn that back around and go, wait, why am I putting these things this clause?
There's also one thing that I missed is where we find them. Where we find the material could be a clue as to what it meant to the people who created it. If we find it in a pit, as opposed to a barrier, we can say something about the level of importance that the person who owned the thing or who held the thing ascribed to it, if they chose to be buried with it rather than bury it in hole. But then even that is sort of biased by our idea of how important being buried with things is. Maybe they had a certain ceremony for burying a pot And that was significant. So it's really the questions are wide open. Yeah.
So I did a way back, exercise, studying my first year physics class, which they handed us a bag of screws and knives, screws and nails and stuff. And they asked us, each group, to categorize. You know, so you actually had to go through, you had to come up with a reason for why X went with Y went with X. So some of them, oh, you know, the first division was, are they pointy?
Yeah.
And others, one's division was, do they have, are they cylindrical or are they square? And I'm wondering whether or not the markings are something that's not necessarily
Let's go back to it.
extremely significant, but it's
Yeah.
just, you know, this is how this group, this family, they liked these marks and they wanted to categorize them or put them together and then so that was my first comment. My second one is, do you know anything about the governance between the Western Basin and the Iroquois nations? Because if you have, and I'm recognizing that that's not necessarily an answerable question, but are you potentially looking at the difference between somewhere where the villages might be more independent versus a much more centrally governed area? And the third one being, going back to the comment about the tools over here, the climatic and general factors in terms of looking at the tools in relationship to what the ecology was at the time, what we know about the climate, but also know about shorelines, basin exposure, what rocks were there, and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
when I'm listening to your talks, it's very interesting. It's like these are some from a geologist point of view, with some a little bit of other stuff mixed in there. That's the
Yeah.
questions that I start asking.
In terms of governance, I don't know that we knew exactly the governmental structure they had, but one thing that informs our thinking around the ceramics that they created is in Western Basin, in this time in particular, they were a lot more mobile. So they lived in multiple places across Essex County, and they moved to where the food was and where it was most habitable. And so that's also one reason they think that there might be so few pots. Not necessarily that they are all in the ground and broken, but maybe they just didn't create as many pots because they had to move around so much. But in terms of like what the governance structure was, I don't know that we know too much about this period. Yeah.
You can start very, very generous.
Yeah.
High level words.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Again, being actually,
Yeah.
being natural.
It could also be the difference between you create two pots, so you decorate more of them, as opposed to you have a lot of pots, so then we're utilitarian, because why would you bother? You have 20, you just move fish, you don't spend a lot of time on a pot, because you're always gonna be making a new one, versus, well, we're gonna have this pot for 10 years. Well, no, I'm just speculating, maybe, we could, you could argue
I
that.
think the value, but in the intrinsic craftsmanship and time, really, I don't think they were considered themselves. I don't think that they would have treated it as like a play pipe, sort of 19th century big pipe, think the opposite of mine.
Or it could be a cultural movement towards stoicism or simplicity versus more florid design.
Well, and to your point, Neil, this is In one of the Ojibwe stories that I've heard, pots are referred to as having a life unto their own, and when they are broken, they die the same way a human does. And so, like that goes to your point that like I don't know that it was a very trivial thing. Like it, yeah,
So I'm gonna share just a quick like experience. I did pottery like before, and the first thing they tell you is to prepare for it to be broken. Because it's gonna break in the kiln. I think it's something like 20% pots were broken
yeah.
during the firing process at least. But
I've done pottery in high school, and yeah,
those things too are, even as an artist, you're like baking over this pot, you have to have some acceptance this is going to break.
yeah,
So there might be like an acceptance there like that. It's not necessarily disposable,
yeah.
but like
it's-
it happens.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing is that, is there not evidence that they used ground up broken pottery as grog?
It's not, it's kind of.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and repairs are really interesting to look at too, because like you only really repair something that you either need or that is like sentimental to you, so.
So the difference in the decorations. Is there a way of telling how long the pot was used for?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of the current station on the inside. You
Yeah.
can tell what they're cooking and you might be able to see how long.
Or how often these?
But that's a very hard thing to
What then
It's
pinpoint.
is the, is the,
Miroslav was saying usage alone, like.
yeah,
What particularly was the pot being used for, and of course, the pot could have
Right,
multiple purposes.
and we can tell that
We
by
tell it's
resin
like
that's inside, yeah.
burial practice, and then other times it's obviously cooking utility, really.
Yeah.
so is there a difference between the airpod and sorry, and the Western Basin usages from looking at the insides of them? Is there a difference between how long they were used? So are they more decorated because they were planning on using them for a lot longer?
That is a very good question, one I can't answer right now, but that is a question that's worth asking, and then maybe even like. Based on what they were used for, is there a correlation between that and the patterns that are on the outside? That's a good question that could be asked in research, yeah. Yeah,
To bring it back to like the point that like everyone else was saying, it's almost dangerous to associate cultural identity with the designs. I could just see it though too, like. The designs being personal or like structural or huge, and how the people view the designs. Like I'm just thinking, this is we're trying to interpret art.
yeah,
It really is like, and I couldn't like take an art document myself.
But, and there's continuity design.
yes, I don't mean to say, yes,
After this personal, which is generational.
and I should clarify that like. There are general patterns.
But
that
they
are,
see it as art
yes,
or
yeah.
as use. Like that's the thing,
Yeah.
it changes completely based on the patterns used.
Yes. Yeah,
Or if it is art, and those are
Yeah.
two very different.
and when you look at this part of the pot. Most pots look like that on the bottom. They're roughened on the bottom. And I've spoken to Michael about this before, and that might even be utilitarian, like that might be roughening the pot to increase, easier to hold. Or increase the surface area, so for condensation, you get a self-cooling pot. Like
Faster.
yeah,
Yeah, there's reasons that, again, when I talk about process technology, there might be reasons beyond storing food, cooking food, that you use pots. You could stick them in water and they would fill up with clean water. And increasing the surface area of a pot on the outside would help that process. We're gonna make some pots and try it.
we're gonna make sure. We've been talking about that for
For a while now, by the time, but one of the things that, I've sat on sites and you notice is like, sometimes you dig up a pot, it doesn't look like anything's ever been in it. It's not glazed, it's just buried around. And it kind of hit me when we were sitting in a lecture one day that
Yeah.
if you were gonna make a pot that you were just putting in wet ground to harvest water out of it, it might look like that. You wouldn't want anything that was boiling or fatty inside because it would wreck the utility of your ceramic filter.
We went to a workshop on pottery, and then halfway through the workshop, we stopped paying attention. We were like, well, what is this? And we were like,
Has anybody done any work on these clay sources?
yes, yes. Not me, I can't answer questions, but they're certainly asking.
I think they've done it here involved.
Yes,
Not talking
They did sourcing of the skating site, so, I know we collected 2 types of clay. We collected a couple types of temper, I know we do 4 different things, and make briquettes. And so they're trying to figure out where they source the clay for the pottery on the Spiegel state up in the area.
there you go.
Where's that?
Clark.
Clarendon, way up there? Okay.
Yes.
It's just local.
I know that we like to assume that every design is unique, but I don't know, I kind of think people are people, and yeah, of course, some pots are really important. But I don't know about you, but I kind of just buy my teacups because I think they're cute.
There is that as well. Yeah.
How do we know how important this is?
Well, yeah, and that's the thing is that just applying a regional identity to it or a linguistic identity or anything like that is like we don't know enough really to be able to say that. And maybe it was just aesthetically pleasing and this is what this person wanted their pot to look like.
Yeah, that's the linguistic part of it, so what we do, like for instance, here with spring mouse. Those are considered cute for a long time. Right, like,
Yeah.
we doesn't necessarily mean they know where they were.
And just because we're questioning these patterns doesn't mean they don't exist, because we certainly do find this type of pottery in very specific regional like areas. This type of pottery is found only in the Western Basin area. So the patterns do exist, but what are they telling us is the question.
I teach, and one of the things I teach is writing presentations. And in the set of presentation lecture I give on presentations, I have some guidelines for students that I got from my advisor about things like colors, things like type, things like that. And I pass that down to my students. So they all will have this a specific style
Yeah.
that I've given to them. And they won't have other stuff because I told them that's just going to make your reader confused. Don't put a block of text on your slide. I wonder how much of it is art like that.
Yeah.
Teaching it from
Passed down.
primary source that says this is really cool to do it with the triangles like this.
Yeah.
And so all my students will have triangles like that.
I mean, really, that's how we learn everything. We like everything that we do, we've like seen somewhere, or yeah.
I mean, it's also really telling that it's not on the plots. There's no zoo forms. There's no representation of the natural world, probably.
That's one thing I should mention is very few pots, but some pots were blank, completely blank in this area. And they were only decorated up here.
But that could just be a change in like status,
Yeah,
like those pots, like more work usually is more expensive. So within that culture, or at least, or they made the pots for themselves and you
Yeah.
had your pots that were your set of pots, like still having a special set of dishes.
or perhaps that was,
Fantastic, though, the black. Pictograph.
But yeah, we know that there's pictographs are part of the cultures because we have, we have them related.
Where we find
Yeah, I mean, where we find them, but there's no fish, there's no trees, there's no rivers, stars, the moon involved. Nothing, right? There must have been some reason why nobody got bored and doodled a bear inside that.
Maybe because pots might not be associated with storytelling.
Even if it's not associated with storytelling, people
Usually
usually
you're back.
yeah. But
Although I do have to say, while I was writing this presentation, I was drinking coffee and I was looking at my mug and I'm like, what does this mean to me? I got this cup because I like the way it looked.
Yeah, but you should initiate pattern.
Yeah,
And like certain patterns people don't like again, my mom's an antique dealer, so I can tell you, some people are like, I only want this shape, China. You don't want any other shape.
Just as that.
Yeah, and it's like, or like, they like the way that a certain lip rolls up, or the straight glass, or the curving ones, people have weird little things, and if we try to associate almost too much meaning to them, it's almost dangerous, because again, we would pick an art style to identify ourselves as a culture, even just like within a city. Like Windsor, let alone an entire group of people.
So this is really stupid question, not from me about pottery, so whoever has no, and well, it is, because I'm pretty sure I know the answer. You can only bake a pot, right? So whatever's in there the first time that you make it on your pot is there permanent. It cannot.
hardened, you mean, yeah.
Yeah, or part of
You
your
can fire.
In almost today, you can, not in grand.
Yeah.
Like to get.
Oh, yeah, there's also the fact that if your grandmother was around, your mother was around when you're watching. That's not the way to do
8
that.
hours,
Yeah.
12 hours, just a wire.
And it's double the
She
chicken.
might as well make another pot.
Well, that was the question,
Yeah.
so the blank pops, the question actually came up is this a? Not one, no. It's me.
Yeah.
Is it possible that this is a blank basically that something else could be done on later?
No, like that.
No,
I think most of the
Most
studies will
someone-
show that any decoration is done prior to firing, even, some pots and have an orange slip to them. And so that was just dumped into, a slurry of clay with poker. Get no orange, so that like all of that was pre-trucked.
Okay, I just wanted.
the plain pots could even be an indication of trade, because like you saw, the Iroquois pots from further up northeast were plain on the neck. So I mean,
it could even be, there was a cultural family putting decorations on pots, so they made blind means deliver.
could be,
Because otherwise they wouldn't be able to trade them,
yeah,
but we didn't.
we try, yeah.
And all the decorations may have not been like permanent, like what if it was rope tied around, we didn't have organics left.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
like instead of a blank pot, it was actually like stuff like beaded with organic with wood or something. They're not created on top.
What questions?
And I'm glad this turned into a discussion, because that's what I was hoping for.
Now he's getting material for his PhD.
I think he likes just being a model right now.
Yeah. Mom.
There's also a study of the general rail pottery, on contact period related sites, where study is whether they were like all transitioned up there, or were the pots brought up with refugees. So it's like another kind of like something else to
Yeah.
have to do about how the decorations were kind of transferred across space.
And even on the Lawson site, where they're saying that there was an influx of people that came in because of the way the site expands, there's evidence of Western basin pots there. Yeah, well, thank you, everybody.